Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I've got a reading update for you. It doesn't feel like that long since the last one, but rather freakishly I've finished a few books since then. So I'll go through them and I'll start off with an audiobook that I finished recently. Mainly because I often forget to mention audiobooks because I don't have the physical prompt to remind me. And I've been listening to over the last, I don't know, 2 months or so, the selected essays of Montaigne, I think translated by Emmy Screech. And it was just to get a flavour, really. I'd heard his name mentioned as this kind of companionable author that people enjoy spending time with, and that people sort of speculate that he was an influence on Shakespeare, and probably since then on numbers of writers. So I wanted to see what Montaigne was like, and found this audiobook to listen to. So I gave it a go and really quite enjoyed it. I'll definitely be going back to Montaigne. He just seems like a very companionable and very friendly um, person to spend time with. The essays he's writing are about all kinds of stuff, about sort of death and about education, about history, about food and health, and sort of all sorts of random stuff about exploration. Um, but it's always him working out what he thinks about these things and relating it to his own life, and it's always in a very sort of intimate way that it's written. So it almost feels more like a diary entry rather than an essay that's meant to be published. So I really enjoyed it. I'm going to get myself eventually, when I can buy books again, I'll get myself a copy of the complete essays, I think, just to slowly make my way through. But I really enjoyed it. So, yeah, if you're sort of intrigued about Montaigne, I'd say, yeah, give it a go. And then I got a little pile of poetry. I finished sort of 3 poetry books since the last update. The first was one that I've been spending a fair bit of time reading. It was the selected essays of, not the essays, selected poems of John Ashbery, a poet that I, for a while, didn't think I'd be interested in. And then through reading The Lives of the Poets by Michael Schmidt earlier this year, and also by watching the channel Leafy Concern as well. And they're really into John Ashbery over there. And so I was just becoming more and more intrigued by him. So I picked up this selection of his poetry. I read bits here and there, and I'd read some of his translations, which I'd enjoyed. And that was one of the things that convinced me as well that I might like him more, was the fact that I enjoyed his translations so much. And I really loved this. I apologies to the squeamish, but I dog-eared every poem that sort of really stood out and I enjoyed. it's quite a few, so it's almost sort of doubled the width of the book. So yeah, I really enjoyed John Ashbery. I'll read one poem that's quite silly, quite funny, and he's not always quite as silly and playful as this, but it's something you often see in him. This one's called Paradoxes and Oxymorons. This poem is concerned with language on a very plain level. Look at it talking to you. You look out a window or pretend to fidget. You have it, but you don't have it. You miss it. It misses you. You miss each other. The poem is sad because it wants to be yours and cannot be. What's a plain level? It is that and other things, bringing a system of them into play. Play? Well, actually, yes, but I consider play to be a deeper outside thing, a dreamed role pattern, as in the diversion of grace, these long August days without proof, open ended. And before you know it, it gets lost in the steam and chatter of typewriters. It has been played once more. I think you exist only to tease me into doing it on your level, and then you aren't there, or have adopted a different attitude. And the poem has set me softly down beside you. The poem is you. So yeah, it's, in its own way, actually quite a sincere poem. After a couple after a couple of readings, but yeah, this evasiveness in his poetry that he's kind of addressing in that poem is probably the main thing that you would notice when reading him. And then after that, I picked up 3 poems by Hannah Sullivan. Funnily enough, there's a collection of John Ashbery poems called 3 Poems as well. So just a sort of tenuous connection between the two. This is a relatively recent poetry collection from about, I don't know, what would that be, 6 years ago. It won the T.S. Eliot Prize, and I'd heard a lot of hype about it. Wasn't too sure whether I'd like it. Waited a while and then picked it up, and sort of dipped in and read the odd line, and liked it. So I had high hopes, but I think really my general impression is that although often the poetry is quite well written, and there are moments of brilliance in here, it kind of left me a bit flat, if I'm honest, and um, I just I just didn't see why I should be reading this as I was reading it, which I don't often feel when I'm reading poetry. And so it'll be one I'll come back to. There are comparisons here to Eliot and Pound, and you can kind of see why in some sections. But I think mainly that's quite superficial. Um, but yeah, it'll be one I'll have to come back to. There were bits I liked, but yeah, on the whole, I didn't particularly love it. And so then I wanted to try something a bit different, and so I picked up Hey Bert by Roberto Pastore, from Pastore Time here on BookTube. And I really enjoyed this, and this was, I think, just what I needed after reading a poetry collection that kind of left me quite flat. It's just really lovely, sincere stuff, and some of it felt like it should be set to music, or really as I was reading it, I could kind of hear music in the background, in a, I don't know, kind of in an abstract way, but I could kind of feel how it could be sort of set to music, not necessarily sung, but like read with music in the background. And I read something somewhere, maybe on Goodreads, that Bert kind of wanted to sort of use this collection as like a bridge for readers who've maybe grown up on Instagram poetry, and try and get them maybe to sort of introduce them to sort of other kinds of poetry. So there's that accessibility to it, but it's sort of opening up to other areas potentially. And I can definitely see that. And as someone who I've never particularly got on with Instagram poetry, even before I was really into reading poetry at all, I never really got on with it. Um, and yet, me coming from the other side, I could still really connect with it. And so I can kind of see how that would work. I do hope that it kind of works the other way for people who, yeah, are more into sort of Instagram poetry and stuff like that. But yeah, it was just what I needed. And I think I picked it up just at the right time. And then the other book that I finished recently, it was part of a buddy read with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics and Randy Ray. Randy is still making his way through it, but it's Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, and it's my first time reading it. I can remember starting it when I was about, I don't know, 16, 17 years old, and wasn't particularly getting on with it. I don't think I even made it sort of 10 pages in before I gave up. But this time around, I really, really loved it. And as I was saying earlier in the Voxer chat, I was expecting to get tangled up in the intrigue and the politics of it all. It's a book about Thomas Cromwell, who sort of rises from nothing to being one of Henry VIII's most trusted advisors, and is really kind of pulling the strings eventually, and is quite important in the whole process when Henry is marrying Anne Boleyn, and they're leaving the Catholic Church, and or I suppose Henry sort of recognizing himself as the head of the church in England instead of the Pope, and so Cromwell is very important and influential in all of that. And I thought that just that, the history, the politics, and the intrigue would be what would be pulling me in, which it did. But more than anything, it was the writing, and I just loved the way that Mantel writes here. It's not particularly direct. She's not hand holding at all. But what she's able to do with suggestion and with inference, with conversation, with subtle conversation, is really, really wonderful. So I just loved it. It's probably one of the best written books that I've read this year. It's not always straightforward. She often, just says he was doing this, he was doing that, and it's up to you to work out who it is. Half the time, it's Cromwell. The whole book is really over his shoulder. But again, if you're paying attention to what people have been saying, and what people think about other people, then once you're getting just brief descriptions of people, even if they're not named, you know exactly who they are. So it takes a while to get used to, but once you're in that world, I don't know, there's something really infectious and wonderful to it. Really, the sort of high, kind of dramatic high of the book is sort of towards the end, where Thomas has risen really, really high, and many of the people who have been in the king's favour for a long time have fallen, and the king has this act of supremacy, and I believe it's that's the recognition that he's the head of the church in England, and that it's not even making him head of the church in England, but it's an act recognising that the King of England has always been the head of the church. So it kind of reminds me of, it's almost sort of a kind of Stalinistic kind of Soviet thing that's sort of being pulled over here. But sort of part of this, and it's all very closely linked to the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and not wanting to recognise his earlier marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He wants people to swear allegiance. He wants people who are closest to him or in his employ to recognise these things and to swear an oath. And one of the people who won't swear this oath on a matter of conscience is Sir Thomas More, who had been the Chancellor, had been sort of the King's right-hand man. And the high drama, really, towards the end of this book are just the conversations between More and Cromwell and some of the other advisors and politicians, just trying to get him to relent, and um, just them reacting to his obstinacy. Um, and yeah, Thomas More has always been quite a complicated figure for me, because in some ways I kind of admire him, and in other ways I find him utterly detestable. Um, and so in this moment, it's a matter of conscience that he doesn't recognise the King of England as the head of the church, and he can see clear as day that the King's first marriage was a legal marriage, that there's nothing sort of counterfeit or wrong with it at all. And so, as a matter of conscience, he's not going to say it. He's not going to shame anyone who does say it. He's not going to speak out against the oath. He just won't take it. And there's a kind of, you could say there's a bravery to that. You could say there's a stubbornness and an obstinacy to that. But I think there is something there to be respected, and I also respect him for some of his writing. I find his book Utopia really, really fascinating. But then he did and approved of some really, really atrocious things, and he seems like such a hypocritical, such a hypocritical person, someone who really shouldn't be venerated as a saint. Um, and I think that the amazing thing about it is that, in a way, Thomas More, by the end of the book, is the villain of the book who can still kind of be respected. And Cromwell, who historically has been seen as a villain, is our hero. And yet at the same time, we can still see all of his flaws as well. And yet somehow, with the way that Mantel writes it, um, somehow we're not casting him in the same light as More. Maybe because he hasn't had a chance to make as many of the same mistakes. I'm not sure. But it's just sort of a great way of slightly changing your perspective on how you see people and how you interpret the past. And so, even though it is a work of fiction and not a work of history, it's really intriguing how it works. And I think I'll be reading the other two books, and then I'll probably be wanting to read a lot more Tudor history, and maybe some of the writings of the people either directly involved or sort of orbiting these characters, like Erasmus and Luther and people like that. And so, yeah, absolutely loved Wolf Hall. And I think on that high note, I'll leave you. So I'll be back soon with a wrap up in the next week or so to go through any other books that I've been working on, and some of my plans for October. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.